didn't do anything wrong. Why are you even here?
We're just trying to understand what happened. Can you tell us your side of the story?
The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting tight was not loud, yet it seemed to sever the chaotic noise of the crowded hallway, leaving behind a ringing silence that only the 17-year-old boy pressed against the locker could hear. It was 10:14 on a Tuesday morning, the kind of mundane, gray-skied day that usually fades from memory before the final bell rings, but for Marcus, the timeline of his life had just bifurcated. To his left stood the school resource officer, a man whose breathing was heavy and whose grip on Marcus's tricep was unyielding, fingers digging into the fabric of a generic hooded sweatshirt. To his right stood Vice Principal Harrison, the architect of this escalating disaster, whose chest was heaving not from exertion, but from the performance of authority. Harrison adjusted his tie, looking past the student to address the officer with a voice that carried the practiced cadence of bureaucracy. "He refused to comply," Harrison said, the words tumbling out with a certainty that threatened to rewrite reality right there under the flickering fluorescent lights. The administrator gestured vaguely toward the classroom door they had just exited, painting a picture of a volatile threat, a student out of control, a situation that had necessitated this immediate and physical intervention. But the air around them was still. There were no overturned desks, no shouting match, no shattered glass. There was only Marcus, standing with a terrifying stillness, his eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor tiles, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew the rules of this game, even if he had never played it before. He knew that any movement, any protest, any attempt to explain that he was simply retrieving a pencil, would be retroactively categorized as aggression. This is the weight of the moment that usually goes unrecorded. It is the terrifying gap between what happens and what is written in the official report. In that hallway, the power dynamic was absolute. The administrator possessed the microphone of institutional credibility. His version of events was already hardening into fact before the ink would even touch the disciplinary referral form. He claimed Marcus was belligerent. He claimed Marcus had clenched his fists and stepped forward in a menacing manner. He claimed that he had feared for his safety. These are the magic words that unlock the machinery of zero-tolerance policies, stripping a student of their status as a child and recasting them as a suspect. Harrison looked at the officer, expecting validation, expecting the nod of brotherhood that often passes between men who believe they are holding the line against chaos. But there was a third witness in this hallway, a silent observer that did not blink and did not possess the biases of the human mind. Resting on the officer's chest, slightly askew, was a small black rectangle with a lens that captured the world in cold, objective definition. The blinking red light was the only indication that the universe might not bend to Vice Principal Harrison's narrative this time. Marcus did not see the light. He only saw his future narrowing down to a pinprick. He thought about his mother's warnings, the lectures about tone and posture, the invisible tax he was paying right now for standing while black in a space that demanded his submission. He wondered if this was it, if his college applications, his quiet demeanor, his clean record, were all about to be incinerated by 3 words spoken by a man who simply didn't like the way he looked. Refused to comply. The fluorescent hum of the hallway lights seemed to grow louder, filling the space between the boy and the administrator with a low-frequency drone that vibrated against the teeth. It is in these suspended moments that the architecture of a school dissolves, revealing itself not as a place of learning but as a theater of control where the script is written long before the actors take the stage. Marcus stood frozen, not out of rebellion, but because he was running a high-speed internal diagnostic that no teenager should have to master. This is the invisible ledger known as the black tax. It is not paid in currency or coin but in cognitive load, a constant, exhausting calculus that runs in the background of every interaction. For Marcus, the tax meant that he could never simply be a student walking to class. He had to be a diplomat for his entire demographic, navigating a minefield where a heavy sigh is interpreted as aggression and a slumped shoulder is read as gang affiliation. Vice Principal Harrison looked at Marcus and saw a threat to his authority, a nail that refused to be hammered flush with the wood. What Harrison failed to perceive was that Marcus was actually trying to minimize his existence, to shrink into a nonentity so that he could survive the encounter without a blemish on the permanent record that his parents treated like holy scripture. To understand the tragedy of this standoff, One must understand the curriculum Marcus had been studying since he was old enough to walk, a syllabus completely unknown to the man blocking his path. There are 3 specific lessons that make up the backbone of the survival guide, 3 stories of caution that had been whispered over dinner tables and shouted during news broadcasts until they were etched into his DNA. The first lesson is about the fallacy of innocence. Marcus knew that in the eyes of the system, his innocence was not a default setting but a privilege he had to purchase with exaggerated politeness and impeccable dress. He knew that unlike his peers who could laugh off a forgotten hall pass as a goofy mistake, his errors would be catalogued as character flaws, evidence of a deeper moral failing that justified the harshness of the disciplinary hand. The second lesson is the myth of the benefit of the doubt. He had watched as friends were ushered into the back of patrol cars for arguments that, had they occurred in a different zip code or with a different complexion, would have resulted in a stern warning to go home. He understood that his margin for error was non-existent. The third lesson, and perhaps the most crucial for what was about to unfold under the unblinking eye of the body camera, was the necessity of the receipt. His father had taught him that the truth does not matter if it cannot be proven. In a world where narrative is power, the person with the ability to document reality holds the shield. Marcus felt the weight of these lessons pressing down on his chest, a physical pressure that made breathing difficult. The irony of the moment was sharp enough to cut glass. Harrison claimed Marcus was refusing to comply, but in reality, Marcus was complying so hard he was practically vibrating. He was paralyzed by the effort to follow every contradictory rule of the black tax simultaneously. Stand up straight but do not look threatening, speak up but watch your tone, defend yourself but do not be defensive. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, as the 2 realities collided. One was built on the shaky foundation of an administrator's fragile ego, and the other was grounded in the cold, hard data accumulating on the server connected to the device on the officer's chest. The open loop of this story was about to close, not with a whimper, but with the digital clarity of high-definition video. The library had always been a fortress of solitude where the variables of life could be controlled through study and silence, a stark contrast to the unpredictable volatility of the hallway outside. Marcus sat at a scratched wooden table near the back, the spine of his advanced placement physics textbook cracked open to a chapter on inertia and momentum. For him, academic excellence was never merely about securing a scholarship or pleasing his parents. It was a calculated survival strategy, a sophisticated form of armor forged in the fires of necessity. He understood early on that in a system designed to view him with suspicion, being average was a luxury he could not afford. Mediocrity was a sentence, but perfection was a plea bargain. Every A on a report card, every debate club trophy, and every perfectly pressed collar was a brick in the wall he built to keep the world's assumptions at bay. This was the defense of excellence. It operated on the unspoken belief that if one could just be undeniable enough, articulate enough, and respectable enough, the systemic machinery of bias would grind to a halt, confused by the anomaly of black brilliance. Marcus wore his GPA like a bulletproof vest, believing it rendered him immune to the casual indignities inflicted upon his peers. He had spent 17 years curating a persona that was chemically incapable of being perceived as a threat. He was the student teachers pointed to as the example, the one who tutored underclassmen during lunch, the one whose disciplinary record was as pristine as the unwritten pages of a new journal. But the tragic flaw in the defense of excellence is that it relies on the observer's ability to recognize value, and Mr. Harrison possessed no such capacity. To the administrator patrolling the corridors with the swagger of a sheriff in a lawless town, Marcus's quiet confidence did not read as dignity. It read as arrogance. When Harrison approached him that afternoon, he did not see the physics student or the debate captain. He saw only a challenge to his precarious authority. The conflict began not with a shout, but with the quiet friction of 2 incompatible worldviews occupying the same space. Marcus was walking to his next class, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who knows exactly where they are going in life. Harrison, perhaps sensing his own stagnation in the face of such youthful momentum, decided to intervene. He claimed later that Marcus looked suspicious, a vague descriptor that serves as the catch-all justification for every unwarranted stop. The irony was visceral. Marcus was mentally reviewing the laws of thermodynamics when Harrison stepped into his path. The administrator demanded to know where he was going, despite the hall pass clearly visible in Marcus's hand. In that moment, the armor of excellence was tested against the piercing lance of bias. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not posture. He simply referenced the school handbook, citing the specific clause that allowed students with high academic standing to utilize the library during free periods. To a rational mind, this was an explanation. To Harrison, it was an insurrection. Intelligence, when displayed by those expected to be subservient, often feels like an insult to the insecure. Harrison's face flushed, not with fear of safety, but with the humiliation of being intellectually outmaneuvered by a teenager. He escalated the situation immediately, his voice rising to compensate for his lack of valid cause. He accused Marcus of insubordination, a charge that holds no water when captured by the unblinking eye of a camera but feels terrifyingly real when shouted in an empty hallway. The bodycam was about to reveal that Marcus's only crime was existing with more dignity than the man attempting to discipline him. The fluorescent hum of the hallway lights seemed to drop in frequency, replaced by the rushing sound of adrenaline that Marcus had learned to systematically mute. This is the moment where the training kicks in, a psychological mechanism that exists entirely beneath the surface of the skin, invisible to the naked eye but deafening within the mind of the practitioner. We often speak of code switching as a linguistic tool, a way of changing one's dialect to suit a professional environment, but for Marcus, standing against the beige lockers with a red-faced administrator breathing down his neck, code switching was a survival function. It was an internal volume knob. He could feel the natural human urge to defend himself rising in his chest. The sharp retort, the expression of incredulity, the instinct to match Harrison's volume with his own. But Marcus reached into the mental dashboard he had been building since childhood and turned the dial all the way down. He stripped his face of emotion, flattened the intonation of his voice, and locked his posture into a non-threatening, statuesque stillness. This is a labor of immense emotional taxation, requiring a teenager to possess the discipline of a seasoned diplomat while being accosted by a man 3 times his age who has lost all control. Harrison was not just shouting, he was fishing. He was casting lines of provocation into the air, desperate for a bite. He needed Marcus to be the aggressor. He needed a curled lip, a rolled eye, or a stepped forward foot to justify the escalation that had already taken place. The bodycam footage captures this dynamic with painful clarity. You can see Harrison's gestures becoming wilder, his personal space encroachments becoming more aggressive, all because the silence from Marcus was starving him of the conflict he felt entitled to. The internal volume knob does more than just quiet the user, it creates a vacuum. When you refuse to participate in the chaos being projected onto you, the projector is left screaming into a void, and that silence amplifies their own absurdity. Harrison's voice cracked as he demanded to know why Marcus was being difficult, a question that hung heavy with irony given that Marcus had not moved an inch nor raised his voice above a library whisper. Inside Marcus's mind, however, the calculus was running at light speed. He was analyzing every micro-movement, ensuring his hands remained visible but relaxed, checking that his backpack didn't look like it concealed anything, and measuring his breath to ensure it didn't look like he was hyperventilating. This is the hidden tax of the interaction. While Harrison was free to indulge in a tantrum, protected by his title and the assumption of authority, Marcus was performing a high-wire act where a single slip, a grimace or a sigh, could result in suspension, expulsion, or physical restraint. The internal volume knob requires the user to dissociate slightly, to view the situation from a third-person perspective, almost as if watching the bodycam footage in real time before it is even recorded. He had to become a vessel of pure compliance, stripping away his personality to become a legally unassailable object. The tragedy of this beat is that this level of self-regulation is often weaponized against the student later. Administrators like Harrison will later describe this unnatural calmness as arrogance, smugness, or a refusal to engage. They will claim that the lack of emotional display was a sign of disrespect, rewriting the narrative to suggest that silence is a form of violence. But the camera does not deal in interpretations of soul, it deals in facts. And the fact was that Marcus was operating on a frequency Harrison could not comprehend. As the administrator continued to berate him for a defiance that didn't exist, Marcus simply waited, his internal volume set to 0, letting the man exhaust himself against the fortress of dignity. He knew that any sound he made would be distorted, so he chose the only winning move available. He let the silence speak for him. The silence in the office was not empty, but rather it was echoed by the memory of a humid Tuesday evening 3 years prior, inside the cabin of a parked sedan where the engine ticked as it cooled in the driveway. It was in that confined, safe space that Marcus had received the training that was currently saving his academic life. His father had turned down the radio, the low hum of jazz fading into the heavy quiet of the neighborhood, and shifted his body to face his son with a gravity that terrified the boy more than any shouting match ever could. This was the moment the innocence was politely asked to leave the room so that survival could take its seat. His father did not speak to him as a child that night, but as a vessel that had to be fortified against a world that would often view his existence as a provocation. This was the transmission of the intergenerational link, a survival manual passed from grandfather to son, written in the ink of caution and hard-learned lessons. Marcus was told that his body was not entirely his own when he stepped through institutional doors. He was taught that his height would be weaponized against him, that his deepening voice would be interpreted as aggression, and that his confusion would be read as defiance. The lesson was specific, brutal, and necessary. It was a curriculum of de-escalation that no textbook in the school library contained. His father had drilled him on the mechanics of non-threatening posture with the rigor of a military sergeant. Keep your hands visible at all times. Do not fold your arms, as it implies closure and resistance. Do not put them in your pockets, as it implies concealment. Let them hang loosely by your sides, palms slightly open, offering nothing to the imagination of the accuser. Fix your eyes on a neutral point, not the floor, which suggests guilt, and not the eyes of the authority figure, which suggests challenge. Aim for the chin, the collar, the knot of the tie. Be present, but be unreadable. This was the armor Marcus was wearing as Administrator Harrison paced around him. Harrison believed he was breaking down a stubborn teenager, unaware that he was actually colliding with 3 generations of survival strategy. The administrator saw a boy who refused to speak, but the reality was a young man who was executing a complex, inherited algorithm designed to neutralize threats. Every time Harrison raised his voice, Marcus heard his father's whisper reminding him that anger is a luxury he could not afford. The tragedy of the moment lay in the disparity of their preparations. Harrison was operating on instinct and ego, fueled by the assumption of his own unchecked authority. Marcus was operating on training, fueled by the terrifying knowledge that a single slip in composure could derail his entire future. The mentor's voice was the invisible thread holding Marcus's spine straight. It was a ghostly intervention, a father protecting his son from miles away, manifesting in the stillness of the boy's shoulders and the calm rhythm of his breathing. The Bodycam footage, which would later be dissected by thousands, captured the physical reality of the room, but it missed this spiritual dimension entirely. It could not record the presence of the father in the room. It could not see that Marcus was not alone in that chair. He was accompanied by the wisdom of men who had survived worse rooms than this, men who had learned that when power screams, dignity must whisper, because dignity is the only thing they cannot confiscate if you do not hand it over. The conference room smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet glue, a sterile purgatory where futures were decided by the stroke of a pen and the nod of a head. 3 weeks had passed since the incident in the hallway, 3 weeks during which the narrative had been constructed brick by the administration. On the polished mahogany table lay the official incident report, a document that functioned less as a record of events and more as a character assassination. The text was littered with charged vocabulary designed to trigger zero-tolerance policies. Words like aggressive, non-compliant, and threatening jumped off the page, painting a portrait of a volatile delinquent that bore no resemblance to the young man sitting quietly in the corner. This was the bureaucratic weaponization of language, a tool used to reshape reality until the victim became the villain. The administrator sat across the table, arms crossed, relying on the institutional weight of his title to crush the student's credibility. In most cases, this is where the story ends. The word of the authority figure becomes the historical record, and the student is labeled, suspended, and routed into a system designed for failure. But today, the geometry of power was about to shift. Marcus's father did not argue. He did not raise his voice or pound the table in righteous indignation, though every fiber of his being likely wanted to scream. Instead, he simply slid a small flash drive across the mahogany surface. It was a gesture of supreme confidence, a movement so subtle it barely disturbed the air, yet it carried the weight of a gavel striking a sounding block. The superintendent, a weary woman who had seen hundreds of these hearings, plugged the drive into the laptop connected to the room's projector. The screen flickered, washing the room in the cold blue light of a Bodycam recording. The timestamp in the corner began to tick. What followed was not a debate, but an exorcism of the lie. The room watched in silence as the footage played, revealing the chasm between the administrator's written fiction and the objective reality. The report claimed Marcus had lunged. The video showed him standing still, hands visible and open. The report claimed he shouted profanities. The audio captured only the administrator's escalating volume and Marcus's calm, measured responses. The true revelation, however, was not just in proving innocence, but in exposing the projection of the adult. The footage revealed an administrator who was losing control of his own emotions, a man terrified by a teenager who possessed more self-regulation than he did. The administrator had demanded submission, not compliance. When Marcus refused to break, refused to cower, and refused to abandon his dignity, the administrator interpreted that stoicism as an act of rebellion. The video made it painfully clear that the aggression was entirely one-sided. The receipts proved that the refusal to comply was actually a refusal to participate in the administrator's emotional breakdown. As the video ended and the screen went black, the silence in the conference room was heavier than before. It was the suffocating silence of a paradigm shifting. The administrator looked down at his hands, unable to meet the eyes of the board. The written report, once a weapon, was now evidence of his own perjury. Marcus remained still, his face betraying nothing, having won the war without firing a single shot. This was the moral victory, the realization that the system's attempt to break him had only highlighted his unbroken nature. The heavy oak doors of the administrative building swung shut behind Marcus, the latch clicking with a finality that felt louder than the shouting match which had precipitated this entire ordeal weeks ago. The air outside was crisp, carrying the scent of cut grass and impending autumn, a sharp contrast to the recycled sterile atmosphere of the conference room where his reputation had been on trial. He stood on the concrete steps for a moment, not in triumph, but in a necessary pause to recalibrate his own reality. There were no cheering crowds, no cinematic swell of music, and no immediate apology from the man who had tried to derail his future. There was only the quiet hum of the campus settling into the evening and the rhythmic thud of his own heart, slowing down for the first time in a month. This was the unspoken aftermath of a moral victory. It does not arrive with fanfare, but with a profound, exhausting sense of relief. As he adjusted the strap of his backpack, Marcus realized that the weight he was carrying had shifted. It was no longer the burden of a false accusation, but the sober responsibility of wisdom earned too early. He began the walk toward the parking lot, his shadow stretching long and thin across the pavement, a visual metaphor for the legacy of the day's events. The counterstory here was not that he had defeated an administrator, but that he had conquered the urge to become what his accuser needed him to be. The system had demanded a caricature of rebellion, a loud and chaotic refusal that would justify the use of authority. By denying them that reaction, by offering them nothing but silence and compliance with his own internal code of conduct, Marcus had forced the system to malfunction. The Bodycam footage was the technological savior, certainly, but it would have been useless if it had recorded a young man losing his composure. The camera only validated the truth because Marcus had already embodied it. The true receipt was not the digital file stored on a server, it was the discipline etched into his character. As he walked past the manicured hedges and the statues of school founders, he understood the final lesson of this open loop. The world would often ask him to participate in his own destruction. It would bait him with disrespect, goad him with unfairness, and attempt to classify his dignity as defiance. The administrator's claim that he refused to comply was a projection of the man's own refusal to accept a dynamic where he did not hold absolute psychological power. Marcus reached his car and unlocked the door, the sound sharp in the quiet twilight. He looked back at the building one last time, not with anger, but with the detached pity of a chess master who has checkmated an opponent who never understood the rules of the game. He realized that the greatest form of resistance was not always a raised fist or a shouted protest. Sometimes, the most radical act of rebellion is simply remaining undeniably, unshakably yourself in the face of a narrative that demands your erasure. He sat in the driver's seat, the leather cold against his back, and turned the key. The engine hummed to life, a sound of forward momentum. He didn't check his phone. He didn't post about the win. He simply put the car in gear and drove away, leaving the accusation, the trial, and the broken narrative in the rearview mirror, shrinking until they were nothing more than a speck in the vast landscape of his future.